starting with my very inaccurate artist rendering of roots. And I was corrected on this slide. I just used this as the intro to the area, but this is we're going to be talking about those things that are underground we don't see, but as a very, probably you'll hear us talking back and forth. This is the most vital part of the plant, folks. But the roots are one of those real vital parts of the plant, but they do not look like this, really. In fact, they do not look like this at all. This is an artist rendering. If you notice, it's almost like the mirror image of the plant, as on the top surface as well as the bottom. And that would really, especially here in California, would never be the case. There's no way our big trees, especially those eucalyptus, can get as deep as they are tall. No way at all. I mean, you've all seen the eucalyptus go down in the rains on the side of a slope, and you see their root structure. And our great, beautiful Torrey pine trees have very little going way deep in the soil. Typically, these, you do obviously have roots going down, but the majority of the roots are the feeder roots on the surface of the soil, and they actually extend well beyond the canopy of that tree. And that will become important when you get into irrigation and watering of plants. So we look at what are those. They're kind of ugly and gnarly and that type of thing, but what is the function of the roots of the plants? And their main function is to take up the water and the nutrients that are coming from the soil. Even in the natural nutrients in the soil, as well as those synthetic or added nutrients that we give it. Typically, we're kind of working it down in the soil. But even putting it, again, since those roots are mainly at the top, you don't have to work your fertilizers and organic amendments way deep into the soil. If you kind of keep them on top, they'll eventually work their way down into the plant. Those roots will also, they're a storage mechanism for that. The plant can't always use all that water. We see that during the rains. They say when it rains, they tell you often, turn off your sprinklers for the next, 2 weeks or something like that after a rain. And the reason why we can do that is because even though you'll feel the soil and be dry, the roots, they took advantage of that and they're storing it and they're ready for it, so it can use it as it's needed. They also store excess food down in there that they will need later. They help anchor the plant. And again, we see this especially, I always find it fascinating looking at plants growing on the sides of slopes, especially our sandstone slopes that we have in San Diego County. And you see how, those roots they're extensive. I was just looking at a property with my sister was in town recently looking at some properties of homes for sale, and big, huge slope with these, probably, 100-year-old eucalyptus on there. And just, you could see just the big surface roots. They'd anchored themselves into this bank that looked like, they looked like they were ready to come down, but you could see that they'd been there for so long. They're able to synthesize those essential compounds of those nutrients that they get, and to be able to reuse those. And sometimes roots are actually the reproductive organ or of the plant. We see this in some of our root crops, like our carrots, our beets, sweet potatoes, and those type of things. The anatomy of the root, we talked about that meristemic tissue or meristemic zone. In the roots, it typically is right here at the end on these root caps, sometimes smaller on these lateral roots here. And it takes in a lot of the water through these little root hairs along the plants and sends it to that meristemic zone. And we call this the zone of elongation. That's where that root is actually growing out. We have our primary root and a taproot system, and then we have our lateral roots. And again, we talked about with that apical dominance, a lot of times this is our primary root, but sometimes, if I cut that off or I remove that plant, then one of these can develop into that primary root structure of the plant. The different types of roots we have. The taproot is, again, classic in that weed we're pulling from our yard, those broadleaf weeds. You really have to get down there and remove it. Otherwise, guess what's going to happen? I'm sure you've all done it. And, you think that yeah, especially some of those nasty ones you'll get into in the class that have all those thorns. I just think, okay, I just try to get it as much as I can, but if you don't get that, it's just going to come right back. It's still alive down there. It collected the water and nutrients it needs. It's lost its ability to photosynthesize very well because it doesn't have anything up above the surface, but oftentimes it can regenerate. We talked about that's one of plants' ability. You can regenerate. So not always, but usually, some plants, especially those weeds, really have that ability to. You got to admire their tenacity, and they can make it through. And that's not to dismiss those fibrous roots too. There's lots of them, and you've got to be able to, and they're tenacious in the soil as well. But they're smaller, but they have a job to do. They have to grab as much as they can and store it and make it happen for that plant. You see these taproots a lot, again, in your root vegetables, your trees. Plants with taproots are much more difficult to plant, when you're seed starting. It's much more difficult to plant and transplant a plant that has an extensive taproot. So that's why if you're planting a tree in a pot, you want to get it to a certain size before you don't want to let it get too big before you transplant it. I've never been very successful in planting carrots and beets and that type of thing from a nursery 6-pack, and I'm much more successful if I start the seed directly in the soil, because I think it's disturbing it when it's fairly young, and again, those meristemic cells are really going, and you're disturbing it as you transplant. I don't know how many of you have had success. I always kind of laugh when I see carrots, and I've seen beets growing in like a single 4-inch plant. There's got to be 10 beets growing in this little clump there. Somebody just stuck the thing. I always feel sorry for the person who bought that plant from the nursery, because really you'd have to separate that out and plant those individually. We see that too sometimes with onions where they're planted in a big old clump. Our fibrous roots plants are much more successful in vegetable crops. If we plant them as, starting them indoors to get them ready, and that accounts for a lot of our bedding plants, and obviously our tomatoes, a lot of our vegetable crops that the roots will generally stay in at the top of the soil. That means the bad side of that is for us in a drought situation means we have to water these plants a lot more frequently, because that top part of that soil will dry out easier, whereas our plants with tap roots, because it's further down, are much more efficient in terms of keeping and storing that water. Adventitious roots, basically, if they're not a taproot and they're not fibrous, some plants have developed a really unique system of kind of giving themselves roots as they go along. They're able to travel very easily. Many of our vining plants, we see this a lot of times with ivy, it's able to actually put in roots up on a wall and establish itself, clinging itself to something that's not even organic matter. We also see this with our strawberries, how they keep plugging along, and many of our grasses, even especially a lot of our weedy grasses in Southern California, that have that ability to keep themselves going along. And I think that is our roots. Any questions about roots on plants? Yes?
Will we talk a little bit more about roots in terms of the soils that they're growing in and how that may come into play?
Yes, you will have an entire class on soils, and right.
And they'll tie into roots.
Yes, you will touch on roots. We were just talking about the different parts of that plant. All of these will come into play. The root structure of the plant will come into play as you talk about soils, as you talk about fertilization, as you talk about propagation, those type of things. Even when you talk about vegetable crops, they'll specifically address some of these issues. Yes. And and as we get into all these different areas, we'll talk. Many of these different areas it will come up in a later class. So we're just giving you the basic structures of the class and what their functions are, so that you can understand why that is important to the plant. And some of this you might have covered in 3rd grade, but you might have forgotten.
Stems. Stems are generally thought of as the above-ground portion of the plant. They support the leaves, the flowers, and the fruit, and they connect them to the roots. In trees and shrubs, the stem provides a sturdy support for the branches. Water, nutrients, and the products of photosynthesis move up and down the stems from the top of the leaves to the tips of the roots. Stem growth can add height to a plant, broaden the area covered by the leaves, and direct growth from darker portions of the plant to areas where there's more light. Pretty important, aren't they? No? Shall we take a closer look? As a stem is being formed, it divides into short sections called nodes, where the leaves and the buds are formed, which would be right here and right here. In between the nodes, we have clear sections called internodes. As the stem grows, the internodes stretch, and you'll see nothing growing in the internodes. They stretch, they spread the leaves and the buds apart. This ensures that each leaf is given maximum exposure to sunlight and air circulation, and that branches are well spaced. At the node, we have buds and we have leaves. Liz talked about meristemic structures. These are meristems along the stem that are composed of immature shoots. And there are terminal or apical buds, which typically make a plant grow taller, and there are lateral or auxiliary buds, which grow into new branches. The buds may lay dormant for years. They may never be used. They're sitting there in case there is some sort of a disaster or some sort of a problem. The tree may become sick, an animal might munch on the tree, a branch of the tree may fall because of wind or fire. So the shoots lay dormant in waiting for some action, so to speak. So why is this important to you to know about the internodes and the buds? We're not talking about pruning today, but when you get to pruning, you need to know where things are located so you know how to prune your plant. If you want your plant, Liz talked about the apical meristem at the top. If you want your plant to grow bushier, you might cut off that apical meristem and the tree will grow bushier. The plant vascular system. In both monocots and dicots, what is known as a vascular tissue forms a continuous system from every root tip to every leaf. The xylem tissue that it forms conducts water and dissolved minerals from the nutrients of the roots and the roots upward. The phloem tissue conducts photosynthetically produced food and other compounds from the leaves to other parts of the plant, up and down. Liz touched on this. In monocots, we have a vascular bundle here, and in it is the xylem and the phloem. And these are in no particular arrangement or sequence. And they are found in things such as lilies, grasses, and palms. In palms, which are monocots, do you know palms are monocots? Palms are not trees. Palms are actually monocots. And the reason they have root growth is because these vascular bundles keep multiplying and growing and pushes the tree outward and outward. And the palm gets a hard kind of crust on the outside. The dicot is a little more complicated. There are two types of vascular systems in a dicot. The soft tissue, green, herbaceous plants have a system that looks kind of like the monocot system. It has vascular bundles, as you see here. The interesting thing, though, to note is that in this vascular bundle, they have an order, and the xylem is on the inside, and the phloem is on the outside. And it's kind of important for you to know. So an example of a herbaceous dicot would be this basil here. In woody dicot stems, the xylem and the phloem occur as concentric zones separated by the cambium. The phloem is also called the sapwood and is the outermost portion of the woody stem or the branch, while the heartwood is the dead or interior area of the branch. And the relative amounts of sapwood and hardwood in any stem can vary greatly in an individual's species and growing systems. Typically when a plant is young or when you have new stems on an old plant, you'll have more phloem or sapwood than you have hardwood. As the plant gets older, say it's a tree, the hardwood will thicken. So why does this matter to master gardeners? Why do you need to know about the xylem and the phloem? You often see plants that are girdled. Someone buys a new plant, they put it in, she's going, yeah, they put it in the ground, right, and they've got a rope around it. You did that? They've got a rope around it. The phloem is typically, like I said, on the outside. If you girdle a tree, you will cut off the phloem. Photosynthesis creates nutrients, and those nutrients try to go down the system to get to the lower parts of the plants and the roots. Well, if that tree is girdled, the nutrients can't get down to the lower portions, and you will actually see kind of a bubble right above the girdle, and the plant will eventually die because it can't get its nutrients. And Laureen told me this morning about a protea at the zoo, which recently died, and she was curious, why did this thing die? Well, she dug it up and she found that they put accession tags on the plants when they're brand new, and they're metal, and this metal tag, she's looking at me like, no way, this metal tag stayed on the plant as the plant grew, and it girdled the plant, and the plant died. So that's why you need to know this. Question?
So if you have it where it's only on half, will half the tree die when you notice something, or will the other half pick up on it?
Say what?
Sometimes people tie a rope or something around the tree just one way.
Right.
This is not girdled.
Oh, sometimes people tie a rope around the tree, around half of the tree, and the whole thing isn't girdled. It may live. It may not. Who knows? As long as the roots are getting some nutrients, it might live. Hard to say.
Yes, ma'am. There's a danger also with sometimes landscapers and their weed whackers. If they go all the way around and they weed whack all the way around and strip all that bark, that will girdle a tree as well.
Did you hear what Wendy said? Landscapers with their weed whackers can destroy the phloem layer, just like an animal could destroy the outside layer, or rat. I hate rabbits. I'm sorry, I hate rabbits. Can destroy that outer layer as well. So, what's next? Stem modifications. In a few minutes, we'll talk about how plants reproduce from seeds, but some plants have modified stems which reproduce without seeds, and this is called vegetative spread. It's kind of an easy way to propagate plants. There are above ground stem modifications in this particular picture, and these are all in your handbook as well. These are called stolons or runners. It's a stem that grows along the surface. It puts down an adventitious root, and then a new plant grows. An example of this would be a strawberry. Thank you, strawberry. There are also below ground stem modifications. You're all familiar with the bulb, I'm sure. If you cut a bulb diagonally, you will see all of these structures. They kind of look like leaves in the bud. in the bulb, excuse me. The bulb has roots, and it actually grows little stems, which can in turn become new bulbs. And the way this happens is you plant your bulb typically in the fall. If you don't pull your bulb up in the spring, does anyone pull their bulbs up in the spring? No, not a one of us, huh? It's too much work. If you don't pull your bulb up in the spring over the summer, it may or may not create new bulbs. And that's another form of vegetative spread. We also have corms. A lot of people get confused with bulbs and corms. They look very similar, but if you cut a corm in half, it'll be solid. You won't see those leafy structures like you see in a bulb. And a corm really has the whole thing. They're structurally plant stems, they have nodes, they have internodes, they have buds, and they produce adventitious roots. So if you leave your corm in the ground, one or a few buds will grow into sprouts that produce normal leaves and flowers. So examples of, we covered strawberries up here. Bulbs might be narcissus, crocus, tulipa. Notice I said tulipa, not tulip, that's a botanic name. And the corms might be cochrasma, watsonia, gladiola, and my favorite corm is the freesia. They smell so nice. And what next? Tubers. Anyone know of a couple of ornamental tubers? Okay, oh, she's trying hard to think. How about begonias? And alströmerias are tubers. And a tuber is fleshy, usually oblong, and it gets thick, and it's actually an it's a thick part of an underground stem with buds or eyes from which new plants grow. A rhizome, I think of a rhizome, I have one in my yard which kind of gets to be terribly invasive. Mexican lobelia, do you know, with the little red flowers on it? No? Red Mexican lobelia, it's a stem that it creeps along the ground and just under the soil, and it puts up. It's got the whole thing. It's the stem. It's got the shoots on it, and it puts up little shoots every so often. So why does this matter to you all? Because we're talking about plant propagation here. It's an easy way to propagate your plants. It's also good to know what's going on under the soil, what kinds of roots you have. Anyone grow alströmerias? And sometimes they die, or it looks like they die, the foliage is dead. Well, walk away, come back later, a few months later, and she's laughing, there they are again, they come back. They come back because they're tubers, and they're actually not dead. Other reasons you might want to know about, perhaps you have an invasive plant, like I have the invasive, what I think is invasive, Mexican lobelia. It's a rhizome. If I take that plant out, I want to make sure that I get all of the roots. Otherwise, that plant's going to come back. Any questions on this? We have questions here. Yes?
The Brazilian pepper, what would it be considered?
The Brazilian pepper, what would it be considered?
Because you know how if you leave even one small portion of it in the ground, it will grow another tree and more and more and more and more.
So she's saying if you leave even one small root of the Brazilian pepper in the ground, it will grow into a tree and more and more and more. So I just consider it downright invasive.
I know. I just wonder
it's got a regular
rhizome? Or
no, it's got a regular root system.
Okay.
Just like, regular root system. Oh, so, what are, does anyone know, these four things, the bulb, the corm, the tuber, and the rhizome? Anyone know what they are collectively called? No. How about the word geophyte? Ever hear the word geophyte? You will sometimes see the word geophyte. And if you see the word geophyte, they are referring to these four items. There was something else, too. I mentioned a number of plant names. I mentioned, let's see, the begonia, the alströmeria, the cochrasma, the narcissus, the crocus, the watsonia, the gladiola, the freesia, and the tulipa. What do they all have in common? What? Bulbs? No, they're geophytes, they're not bulbs. Okay, those are all botanic names. Those are all Latin botanic names. So, if you think it's difficult to pronounce Latin botanic names, you've been doing it for years. And many of the plants we know actually have Latin names. There are others. Hosta, Delphinium, there are other Latin names. Not to get back on that again. Okay. What's next? This is just kind of a curiosity. Are these stems or are they roots? Yeah, they're actually roots. Stems. Stems are leaves. They're actually stems. The opuntia on the right side. Oops. The opuntia on the right side. These are the leaves. These tiny little protrusions. Those are the leaves. All the photosynthesis of the opuntia takes place in the stem. Not all of it, but most of it takes place in the stem. This other plant here, it just looks like a massive tangles, and that's an acacia aphylla, and those are all stems as well. And notice you probably haven't heard either of us use the word always. We say usually or often. That's because there is very little of anything in this horticulture that is always. There are exceptions to every rule. And that is it for stems. And Liz is going to come back up and talk about leaves.
As Mo said, yeah, there is no always. I used to, when I worked at Miracosta, my boss there would always tell me the most important thing to remember is plants don't read books. So they often will behave in ways that, you know, and it used to drive me crazy because when I used to do plant ID classes and we'd see, you know, we were doing identifying pines. A lot of the ways that you identify pines is by the number of bundles, the number of needles in a bundle. And, you know, sometimes I'd have it all out there and someone would say, well, this is wrong. This one has this in it. And it's like, okay. Again, even in nature, there's all kinds of things. But that's kind of where we get a lot of our cultivars that Mo talked about earlier. A lot of our hybrids come sometimes from some of those things that occur just out of the norm, but people like it. Like, I don't know how many of you know that, in fact, as we talk about leaves, that we see variegated foliage. And I always love plants with variegated foliage, but when in my work at the Botanic Gardens, there was one of our horticulturists there. He said, as a horticulturist, he said, I hate plants with variegated foliage, and that's because variegation in a leaf is actually a virus in the leaf, which is a disease, but it's something that we cultivate because we think it's pretty. But he said, when I see that, I think disease. And so it was always really off-putting to him to have a plant with variegated leaves. But leaves this is kind of where the miracle is occurring in the plants in the plant kingdom. I know Mo will argue with me next time up about the flowers, but this is truly what makes the things in the plant kingdom unique is these leaves and their function within the plants, because the whole purpose of the leaf is to harvest light that comes from the sun. It's going to turn into the energy source for food manufacture from photosynthesis, and in turn we're going to all benefit from this process as well. First, we'll just talk about the simplicity of the leaf itself and the structure of the leaf before we go on to its processes. But here I'm showing the parts of a leaf. The one on the side, we call it a simple leaf, and a simple leaf is one that just occurs, the leaf itself is it's singular. You can see, you really can't see as well on this, but I should have brought in some leaves to show you as examples, but when we call a plant a simple leaf, Mo talked about stems, these auxiliary buds that appear along the stem. The leaf will attach, it has this on the petiole of the leaf, which is the part of the leaf that attaches to the stem, and at the point that it attaches, it has this thing called a stipule, which is like this little swollen little base right there at the stem. And it's actually, you can kind of tell where the stipule is, because if I go to pull the leaf off, it breaks off really easily at that point. And that's when I know, when I can pull that simple leaf off the stem, that's when I know I have a single leaf or a simple leaf versus a compound leaf. And a lot of times you would see, oh, those things, those are all leaves. Well, no, they're not. Those are leaflets. Because if I were to look at that leaf and I were to try to pull that off, it's going to more break off that little part of the petiole. And that's because there is no stipule present along those little leaflets. The stipule is present way down here at along the stem. And that's how I see that I have a compound leaf. And there's a lot of different types of compound leaves that we'll look at. So here we look at the simple versus the compound leaf. And again, the classic simple leaf is our magnolia leaf. It's a nice, big, easy, recognizable leaf. Again, it attaches simply to that stem on that stipule there. My compound leaves, there's a lot of plants that have compound leaves, and here it's showing the black walnut leaf, but again, I think, can anybody think of some of your landscape plants or trees that have compound leaf? I can think of African tulip trees, the jacarandas are actually a binnately compound leaf, because they're actually like, I would have this on top of, there's multiple compound leaves on the same leaf. So if I were to take, again, when we were taking plant ID classes at the college, we would have students do a leaf collection, and technically they had to take the whole leaf. So if they were looking at a plant with a bipinnately compound leaf, they couldn't just take a piece of it. They had to include the whole leaf breadth to include it. And some things like, for example, the plant we call the botanic name, the Nandina domestica, the heavenly bamboo, if you're familiar with that, that actually is a huge bipinnately compound leaf. The leaf is actually, can get really big like this. The students could never include it in their notebook because the leaf is, it's coming off in all different directions. The leaf itself is actually ginormous, and that's because of where the stipule falls along that leaf. But a lot of times we do tend to, in Southern California, use as one of our references that Sunset Western Garden book, and we have it at the hotline office when somebody's calling you about a plant. Sometimes you can, if somebody's sending you a picture of the plant, you can usually visually eye where that stipule is. Because a lot of times when people are asking you to identify a plant, it's often because it's not in flower. And so you're looking at a plant and you're trying to ID something without a identifiable flower, where you're looking at it in your yard. So when you refer to the Sunset book, it'll tell you, typically in its description of the plant, it'll tell you whether it's a simple or a compound leaf or a bipinnately compound leaf. This one here is called a palmately compound leaf, because you can see it's like the palm of your hand. The leaves are coming off, directly, almost like that, and attaching to the stipule down here. Okay. The arrangements of the leaves on the stem are also some way that we distinguish when we're trying to key out a plant or identify it. The most common arrangement of leaves on the stem, besides our grassy type of plants, are the leaves being alternate along a branch. Where they, again, you have one leaf kind of here and half an inch up further, I have my next leaf coming out, but those are all simple leaves that alternate along the branch. Versus leaves that are opposite. Less common, but still, it's probably existing in 20% of plants at least, this opposite arrangement. There are some times where the alternate leaves are so close they almost appear to be opposite, but if you take a closer look, you'll see like two stipules, or you'll actually see them, they're a little bit up higher. So again, and when you're keying these out, when somebody is giving you something, you're going to Sunset to reference it to see, well, is this what I'm looking at, or is it this? You'll see it. Opposite plants are a little bit less common in the plant world. A very common leaf arrangement is this whorled arrangement, where the leaves are kind of in a circle around that stem. And we see that like in our pittosporum. Trying to think of what else we have.
Cleveland sage.
Pardon?
Cleveland sage.
Cleveland sage. So if we were, I don't know if you do this in the lab, if I was really into this stuff, and a lot of times with studying these things, they actually have these keys. We're not really going to go into all of these terminologies and that type of thing, and even Sunset would touch on this a little bit when they're identifying a book, but there's actually a scientific, a Latin name for all of those different shapes of a leaf. So if you really want to get into it, some of them are things like cordate, like shaped like a heart. There's a spear shape, I forget what the Latin name for that is, but there's different words that describe each of these leaf shapes. Sunset is mainly going to tell you it's an oblong leaf. They may say it's a cordate leaf, you know, that type of thing. They're typically not going to get this scientific with you because most of their reading community doesn't know all of those words. And at the same time, too, those leaf margins sometimes also tell us, you know, what type of plant that is. So the way that the leaf is on the very edge versus that magnolia leaf that's completely smooth along the edge. Others have little, like a lot of the lavenders have little dents along the side that has a name. So as I'm looking to distinguish, you know, and this is where you get into people distinguishing one species from another or one type of plant from another, is they'd be looking for those things, not only the similarities between plants, but the things that make it different, to know that I'm not looking at the same plant. Because if I'm just looking at leaves, a plant with little half-inch oblong leaves, I could have a lot of plants that look like that, but it's when I start looking at how are they arranged on the stems, what are the leaf margins looking like, sometimes looking at the venation of the leaf, what does that look like, that can give me an idea, further clue in terms of what that type of a plant is. But again, I'm not going to usually drill down to that level, but I wanted you to know that those terms exist and they're there. So photosynthesis, what really is it? It is, it's a miracle in some ways. Each of the leaves, our leaves have a very thin protective layer. It's epidermis, just like human has. It's kind of like a skin on the leaf, and that epidural layer may be, do you think it would be thicker if a plant was predominantly a sun type of plant, or do you think it would be thinner versus a shade plant? Yes, it'd be thicker, just because it would allow itself more sun protection or more protection from the sun. Those plants that need to survive in the forest, that would be a little bit thinner. That's a protective layer, and right under there is the chlorophyll, the green part of the plant, the thing that makes the plant green or silvery colored, or you know, some of those variations there. And that green, that chlorophyll is what's going to, and then right next to those, filling in the space there, are the stomata, which will basically allow the plant to breathe in and out. So what's happening is the sun is out, my leaf is sitting there, it's able to take that light from the sun, combine that with the water it's getting from the soil, and it's actually able to make its own food. Okay, so that's why we say it's an autotroph. It's actually able to give it the energy it needs to exist, and even store that food for when it needs it. And there's a chemical formula on the side if you're interested in that. I think it's in your book too. And then in the process of doing that, so it's taking the carbon dioxide from the air with the sunlight, taking that water in from the soil, and in the process, not only is it making its own food, but it's giving back. It's also releasing oxygen into the air. So that's why in environments, when you're out in the forest, you notice how clean and fresh that air is out there, because we don't have the city and all that stuff around us. We feel like it's very good oxygen because we have all this plants, you know, and matter that's releasing this into the environment. So, and again, this is what makes plants unique in their world, in the plant kingdom, as opposed to, we said the reason why a mushroom is not a plant is because it does not photosynthesize. It does not have the ability to make its own food. And obviously humans don't either, although we think by planting in our gardens, we're doing that. I just got one of these Fitbit surges for Christmas, and it's telling you like how many calories you're burning and that type of thing. And basically, we often hear about how many calories we burn during a workout, and that actually burn of calories is a process called cellular respiration. And plants have a similar type of process that they go through. And typically, but not always, they go through this respiration process at night. And this is when they're actually taking that food and they're breaking it down, deciding what they're going to use, and then just like we would perspire or let things go when we have that cellular respiration process, the plant is too, and they release a little bit more of that, a little bit of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, even some water vapor. Like sometimes you can go to a plant in a greenhouse and you can see like, where did that come from? Again, it's the plant respiring. And again, it typically occurs at night, but again, sometimes again, that is something based on time of year. this in terms of transpiration is something where it's starting to get a lot of attention in, especially in our drought areas. We're starting to look at this a lot. In fact, if you look at a lot of times some of the things that the WaterSmart plant website has, it'll start to talk about the transpiration levels of certain plants. You can get a better idea. It's referring to, basically, that is the process of which the plant is absorbing that water, and how much is lost due to that transpiration process is, how much water is lost due to the effects of the sun, on temperatures, on different environmental conditions. And it's giving us, we're starting to look at this a lot more closely as we start to look at, by studying things like those plants that do well in those Mediterranean regions and adapt themselves, they're starting to look at, they have a more effective rate of transpiration. They're able to save themselves a little bit more in a hot, dry climate condition. But by understanding this, we're able to kind of learn a little bit more about how these plants, what plants are best adapted to our environments, or how do we, if we do have this extended period of drought, what are the best ways to address some of these things within our environment? What are the ways that we can look at that? And again, you especially see with with the farmers, that are small farmers who are looking at their crops and the transpiration levels. And you'll encounter this a little bit too when you go into the irrigation. I'll talk a lot about evapotranspiration and you also see it with grasses. I know I have a friend who's really into golf course management a lot of times by looking at what the grasses are doing and that type of thing. So that is the process of where. And again, most of this process of transpiration, it can occur during the day or during the night. It happens more on a hot day than in the evening. And it's a plant's ability, again, we're looking at those plants' ability to protect itself and to reduce their water loss. The same thing, I think, even in terms of when it's cold, even you'll hear the plant transpiring at night, that water on that leaves, and we hear about to prevent that process is covering up some of your plants in the evening, your more sensitive plants, to protect them from that. So any questions about leaves and, yes?
So does a drought-resistant plant also take up water more efficiently, or it just doesn't transpire it?
Well, again, drought-resistant plants have a number of things that they share in common. Typically, their leaves tend to be smaller. Their leaves tend to be, they have a thicker epidural label. That's why you'll see a lot of them are succulent-y. They will, you'll even see sometimes, like Mo was talking about the stems, a lot of times you'll even see in a lot of our drought-tolerant plants, even they'll do some, because their leaves are smaller and they still need to perform this function of photosynthesis, a lot of times you'll see a lot of our drought-tolerant plants will have greenish stems. The stems will be more colored. They will have, typically they have a better taproot system in them, so a better ability to store water. We obviously see that with our succulents. They actually are able to even store water in their leaves. They have very small stomata that's in the leaf that are closed during the day on almost all cactus and succulents. It's something unique to them. So they have a lot of native adaptations that let them subsist more. They tend to be like gray colored plants, because they can reflect that sun, so they don't have as much chlorophyll. Yes?
I think this pertains to the one question on the quiz. And when you said the stomata on the succulents are closed during the day, so are they creating photosynthesis with a closed stomata? The question was, in order to have photosynthesis, the stomata must be open. So are they doing photosynthesis when the stomata is closed during the day on those types of plants?
I can't answer your quiz.
Well, I think that was
I will
the
say
problem.
all plants photosynthesize. So they do. So whether they do it maybe they restrict their hours, I'm not exactly sure of the answer to that question. All plants photosynthesize. The only plants that don't photosynthesize are your parasitic plants, because they have lost that ability. So they actually, so they at one time they did, but things, are your parasitic plants that like your Spanish moss and those type of things, they do not photosynthesize.
Right, but that
So,
wasn't the question.
yes.
It's whether are they photosynthesizing with the stomatas closed on some plants.
They are. Yes, I believe they
So
are.
that's the one question.
I would say they are. I would argue that they are, but the answer is probably directly from that book. So, yes, yes.
So a plant photosynthesizes, if that's a verb, when,
It's a verb.
okay.
It's a process.
So a plant photosynthesizes with any green part of the plant or just the leaf? Like wherever there's chlorophyll?
Typically, and she wanted to know if a plant photosynthesizes, typically it photosynthesizes where the chlorophyll is present. So generally speaking, that is the leaf. But some plants have added adaptations, like we see what's the common plant in the tree in the
Palo Verde.
Palo Verde is a good example. We also have the plant with the thorns along the base. It's the Corycia speciosa, the Civa speciosa. See, that's one that has two botanic names. That Chinese silk floss tree, I think it's called. Yeah, you see a lot of times that greenishness along a stem is actually, it's an added thing for those plants that need that. Because again, the leaves on that Palo Verde loses a lot of its leaves, especially during the summer. It needs an ability to be able to photosynthesize, so it's lost all of that. And again, you see that if I'm walking the native trails, you see that as well. So on a lot of our natives. Okay.
And now we'll talk about the most important part of the plant. Which of course is the flower. Notice on this slide all that pollen. Can you see that pollen on that bee? It is just covered with pollen. So let's talk about flowers. Flowers come in many forms. Some flowers, like the tulipa, comes on a single stalk. Other flowers come in clusters called inflorescences, which means an arrangement of flowers on a plant. If you look at this lantana, how many flowers do you see there? There are multiple flowers on that lantana. That is not just one flower. There may be 20 or 30 individual little flowers with all the reproductive parts on that one little flower. You can call it a flower. I call it a flower. If we want to be botanically correct, we would say, oh, look at that beautiful inflorescence. Okay, so why do flowers have different shapes? It's all about attracting their pollinators. Flowers have different shapes to attract their pollinators. Umbels, like this one, and composites, like this one, are ideal little landing platforms for insects. They can sit on these florets here, and they can sit there and they can eat that nectar and get that pollen rubbed all over them. Other plants, larger flowers, like spikes, have spikes. They have larger flowers here, and those are basically made for birds. Oh, and there are many shapes here, and there are many more. No one expects you to memorize these names or to even know these names necessarily, but as you're reading about flowers, they will describe the flower and they will use one of these names. So it's nice to be able to go, oh, yeah, okay, I know what that means. But by no means do you need to memorize it. So why do plants have flowers? Reproduction is the sole purpose that plants have evolved. The pleasure we receive from flowers is purely coincidental. With their flamboyant shapes and beautiful colors, flowers are doing the very best they can to attract their pollinators. But wait, there's more. They can also emit lovely scents to attract bees or putrid odors to attract flies. It's true. So, we are going to talk about sexual reproduction today, and there are two types of reproductive cells, basically. First, If you look at this platycerium, staghorn fern, this particular plant has spores, as most ferns do. You see the little brown spores that fly off the plant. Well, what they do, and you can see this in a rainforest very clearly, the spores will fly off, in this particular case, the staghorn fern, and they will land on a tree, as this one did. This is an actual picture. And the spores divide, and they divide, and they divide, and pretty soon you will have another staghorn fern. You can't stand there and watch them do it. It takes it, but it does happen. The second type of reproduction is sexual, and let me first point out this plant. This is a monocot. It's called an Amorphophallus peonifolius, black spath. And this is one case when a common name really helps. It's called a elephant foot yam. This is thought to be the largest flower in the world, and if you could see underground, you could see that it actually has tubers. This crop is grown in, I didn't say crop, didn't I? This plant is a crop grown in Asia for the yams. Kind of interesting. And it does reproduce sexually. So we're going to talk about sexual reproduction, but let's first take a look at the structure of a flower. This is a diagram of a perfect flower, called perfect or complete. And let's take a look at it. It's also called do I have this on here? It's also called a bisexual flower because it has female and male reproductive organs on it, or structures on it. So let's start at the bottom and work our way up. At the bottom we have a pedicle, which is supporting the flower or the inflorescence. It also supports this receptacle here where the reproductive organs of the flower grow and often become fruits. The next thing is a sepal, and I guess the easiest way to describe what a sepal is to think about a bud of a rose that hasn't opened yet, and you see those green leaf-like structures. Those are the sepals. They protect the flower, they protect the bud until it opens and turns into a flower. And there are typically the same number of sepals on a flower as there are petals, and the sepals are collectively called the calyx. That's what the sepals are collectively called. The next thing is the petal. Petals are actually often pretty colorful, and they typically surround the reproductive organ. And a petal, all the petals together are collectively called the corolla. The next thing is the male reproductive portion of the flower, and this is called the stamen. It consists of a filament, which is basically a stalk that supports the anther, and the anther is where the pollen is created. On this side we have the female, which is called the pistil, and it starts with the ovary, and in the ovary are something called ovules, which are unfertilized, immature little seeds. And up from the ovules is a style. The ovary is a style, and on top of the style is a stigma. And the stigma is kind of sticky, so that when the pollen blows in the wind or whatever, it can stick to the stigma. In order for pollination to happen, the pollen must get on the stigma, and then in order for fertilization to happen, the pollen must go down this tube, the style, and get to the ovary. So, how does this happen? Some flowers have large quantities of nectar and convenient perches which attract pollinating animals, such as bees, birds, and bats. Nectar is often at the base of the flower, so when the insect or the animal comes to seek nectar, it's going to brush across or brush against the flower's reproductive structures while accessing the nectar. As the pollinator exits, Pollen grains transfer from the male reproductive organ to the female reproductive organ or to a female reproductive organ on a different plant. So if pollinization and fertilization occurs, that means the pollen gets all the way down to the ovary, the ovules begin to develop into seeds, and the ovary begins to enlarge, eventually developing into a fruit. Pretty simple. Any questions? No? We all got it? We all got the sex thing? Okay, a couple of weird things about, that people may ask you about pollination and cross-pollination. What happens if I cross a Fuerte avocado with a Hass avocado, they ask. What kind of a fruit am I going to get? You don't know. You are going to get whatever kind of fruit the mother plant has. So if you cross a Fuerte with a Hass, you're going to get a Hass avocado. However, the seed might be a Hass, it might be a Fuerte, or it might be, who knows what it might be. So the seed can be different, but the fruit will be true. How about, can I cross, and what's going to happen if I cross an apple tree and an orange tree? Nothing. Yeah, you got that right. I should say most often, I don't want to say always, but you most often have to cross with the same genus. You cannot cross with different genus, with a different genus. Okay, some flowers don't have, some plants don't have showy flowers. Any idea why some plants don't have showy flowers? They're wind pollinated. Think about grass. Those are got to be the most boring little flowers. They don't need to be showy because they're pollinated by wind. They're wind pollinated. Okay, so that's a perfect bisexual flower. Let's look at a imperfect flower, which is also called incomplete. An imperfect flower has a female flower, female reproductive organs or male reproductive organs, but not on the same flower. My pictures looked, my slides looked pretty, I don't know, pretty common, pretty sterile. But if you get into the real world, you will see that things are much different. If you look at this zucchini, this is actually a photograph of what a male stamen looks like and what a female stigma looks like. So don't be confused when you're looking at these pretty little diagrams, when you get out into the field and you go, God, I don't understand that. I don't see those things. It is difficult sometimes, so don't be surprised. Oh, and the thing about the zucchini is, this plant has female flowers and male flowers, but they are not in the same flower. So has anyone ever tried to grow zucchini? And she's going, yeah, and sometimes they just don't produce fruit. So bees are supposed to pollinate zucchini. Sometimes they don't do their jobs. So what you can do is you can get a little paintbrush out, and it's easy to tell the female flowers versus the male flowers in zucchini. So you get a little paintbrush out, and you take that paintbrush and you rub that anther with the pollen on it on the male zucchini. You take it over to the female zucchini, and you rub it on the stigma, and you may be hand pollinating your zucchini. Or if you don't have a paintbrush, or if you're a little too lazy, just pull that darn male flower off. What good is he anyway, right? And you can just pollinate the female with the male flower. So let's look at 4 common situations. We talked about the perfect flower, which has a stamen and a pistil, both on the same flower. That's called perfect, bisexual, and hermaphroditic. And I don't think that's a Latin word. It's kind of difficult. We also have some examples of a perfect flower. Is there a question? Would be a hibiscus, a Prida Madeira, and all of your daisies are perfect flowers. Here is an imperfect flower. It's called monoecious, and that would be our zucchini. We have one plant. It has male parts. It has female parts, structures, and male structures. both on the same plant, but on different flowers. Then we have another structure here. We have plants that only have male flowers and plants that only have female flowers. This is really making sexual reproduction difficult. Some examples of those would be kiwi, spinach, ginkgo, and date palms. So why is this important that you know this? Someone calls you on the hotline and they say, my plant isn't flowering. You say, well, what's the name of your plant? Now that might be a little difficult to ascertain to start with, right? Once you ascertain the name of the plant, then you figure out if it's a dioecious plant. If it's a dioecious plant, you know that you need, for example, in the kiwi's example, you need a male and a female plant. Otherwise, you're not going to have pollination and fertilization. So, why does Mother Nature make things so challenging? The reason is that Mother Nature is trying not to let the plant self-pollinate in order to create genetic diversity. Species that normally cross-pollinate have more genetic variation and a greater chance of adapting to changes in the environment. And some ways it does this. On some plants you'll see the female stigma is much higher than the male anthers in the pollen. That's so the pollen cannot get, in the wind, the pollen cannot get on the stigma. In some pine trees, the female cones will be at the top of the pine tree, the male cones will be at the bottom. Did you know that? She's shaking her head, yes. Did you know that? That is so the wind or the rain cannot take the male pollen from the bottom of the tree and lift it to the female cones. Also, this is really weird. There are many perfect flowers that are able to recognize and reject their own pollen, preventing inbreeding, despite the fact that they are perfect flowers. And what is next? Fruit. Okay. The fruit is a part of the plant that contains the mature, swollen ovary and the seed. Common fruits are apples, berries, cherries, and botanically speaking, there are some edibles which we think of as vegetables, but they contain fruit because they are the part of the plant that develops the flower and contains the seeds, such as tomatoes and peas. And the length of the time from flowering to fruit can be quick. It can be just a couple of weeks, or it can be many months. And some of the factors are the number of daylight hours, the light intensity, the temperature, the soil moisture, and the internal nutritional status of the plant. As the fruit matures, sugars and aromatic compounds that contribute flavor accumulate, and during the final stages, the fruit usually changes color and softens. Some species of fruit may be picked before ripening and will develop a good eating quality. For example, tomatoes, bananas, pears, avocados, and apples. Other species must fully ripen on the plant in order to reach a good eating quality, such as grapes, strawberries, and oranges. And this is just a couple other plants. Macadamia is a fruit. It is a nut, but it is still a fruit. So when you see the ad, eat your 5 fruits and vegetables, you can head for those macadamias. This is an example of a tree in Africa called the Cagelia africana. It gets a beautiful flower on it, and then this is the fruit. Part of the reason I said that flowers are here are so that they can reproduce. Well, in this particular instance, the fruit is formed. Elephants eat the fruit. So as the elephants eat the fruit, the seeds pass through the elephant's digestive system. The elephant drops the seeds along with a little bit of fertilizer, and that's how the plant reproduces. So, and banana is really interesting, and we'll talk about that when we go to the Botanic Gardens in Encinitas in May. It's got a really strange sex life. Any questions?
Well, because it does, it's kind of what comes first, the chicken or the egg, and it's like we didn't know whether to start with seeds or end with seeds. But as Mo was showing, that whole purpose of that flower was to attract its pollinator, or it was designed in, is that not? Okay, is we on? Okay. So the whole purpose of that was to basically allow it, and it wasn't so that we could necessarily enjoy the flower or enjoy the fruit, which is the matured ovary as a result of that pollination, but it's basically so the flower could go on, so that plant could go on. So its whole purpose, it's designed to to produce its seed. And I'm not going to go into a lot of this, but again, we're looking at the difference again between those monocots and dicots. So even though, again, we said that's not very important, it is important. Again, that comes up again and again and again. Our classic bean seed, our classic corn seed. Basically, in the dicots, we actually have this little radical, which is that's actually the stem that the seed actually contains. The plant is basically there. And if the plant is basically, it's ready to go in the seed, we consider that seed to be viable. So that seed, all that seed will need is, the proper environmental conditions. That's its water, the proper soil, the proper temperature, all of that stuff to get going. Some seeds even need to be burned in order to get started. If the seeds are at the back of the seed package, we always look at it. It actually will tell you what time of year did that seed get planted, how deep should you plant that seed, how much water, how much light, whether you keep it covered. All of that stuff goes into protecting that viability of the seed. Mo showed again with the type of fruits. Fruits, a lot of times we were thinking of those fruits that we're eating, like the tomato and the apple and those type of things. But when we say all plants fruit, fruit is things like those nasty Brazilian pepper trees we talked about. Those little peppercorns are the fruit of the Brazilian pepper tree. In fact, you hardly even notice the flower on that tree. But even things like acorns and pine cones and they all have different names too, which I'm not going to go into here. But and the types of the seeds are designed to, again, how they're going to be spread. It's all part of nature's design, is whether I'm going to be spread. Mo talked about the Kiglia being spread by the elephants who are ingesting it and walking along. So we consider those kind of the takeaway plants, like the squirrels, or the squirrels taking the acorns from the tree. We also have those things we refer to as hitchhikers, those like foxtails and stuff like that catch on you as you walk away, and that's how that seed is getting dispersed. And the juicy things like the berries that will break down very easily and again can be dispersed from an animal in its digestive tract. Things that are wind pollinated. Mo referred to the grasses, our classic dandelion. That's how those seeds are being spread. And those wing seeds, we used to always play with in the Midwest as kids, from the maple trees. Again, blowing away like little helicopter plants and and spreading themselves around. I always love the poppies, and if you ever have one of those poppies, they're like exploding, or pepper pot plants, that the seeds will actually explode to send themselves around and to populate. So there's a lot of different varieties and of ways that the seeds spread themselves around and remain viable. So again, they're either the alpha or the omega. The seeds are kind of at the beginning and the end. And then our final slide here is, the book goes into this a little bit, so we just did it as a catch-all at the end because we weren't sure where we were going to be able to wrap up. But we talked about the different parts of the plant, and we talked a little bit about monocots and dicots and things with perfect flowers and imperfect flowers. But we didn't really talk about plants in general and kind of how we classify them. As plants are classified a lot of times based on their growth habit. Is it an annual? Is it a perennial? Is it a tree, a shrub? Based on its structure and form. There's all things, again, that kind of cross over into those things. Things that we think of as annuals, you'll notice, again, depending on we're here in Southern California, will be perennials for us often. So, depending upon where you live, doesn't necessarily qualifying along those lines all the time. A biennial is something that goes through 2 seasons. Our structure, our woody plants versus our herbaceous plants, we talked a little bit about that when we talked about stems. our vines, our trees, our shrubs. Again, sometimes shrubs and trees will kind of cross over each other. Even sometimes a herbaceous plant will cross over into a shrub, depending on its maturity and its size. Leaf retention, whether a plant is evergreen and deciduous. And again, this is where the photosynthetic process is very unique here, and the science behind that is just is something very interesting. A lot of times, too, we look at plants and their climatic adaptations, tropical plants, which basically cannot tolerate anything below a certain temperature. Like even the slightest freeze that we have wouldn't be able to survive, versus we consider ourselves in more of a subtropical region, an arid subtropical region, where our plants here, subtropic plants, typically can take a little bit of cold exposure, but not a sustained period of cold exposure, versus those things in a more temperate climate that can take different things. Again, plants use, whether it's strictly, a lot of plants we're growing strictly as ornamentals, a lot of plants we're growing as edible crops, and now we have a more and more push to, especially here in Southern California, for our native plants. Like, let's plant things that, you know, we don't have to do anything special to have them survive in our environment. So those are all different classifications. And we're done with your introduction of horticulture.